Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Vasilii Khammad. He's a physician and researcher. Today's Kevin MD article is International Medical Graduates Need Real Protections. Vasilii, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Russia.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so why don't you just briefly share your story? And I think your story is part of your Kevin MD article, and you could jump into why you decided to write in the first place.
Sure. Well, I'm Vasilii Khammad. I came to the United States in 2019 as a Fulbright Scholar at The Ohio State University. And the Fulbright Scholarship, as some of your viewers may know, is a cultural exchange program sponsored by the US Department of State. And my invitation to the country was signed personally by President Trump. By then, I had already finished my medical school in Moscow, completed residency in medical oncology, and was working on my PhD thesis in neuro-oncology. And in 2024, I had a very challenging match season and interviewed at 12 residency programs. So there was one particular pediatrics program which left a very positive impression on me. And the program director spoke about supporting the African American community and underrepresented groups in medicine, which I personally really respected as a Fulbright Scholar and as an IMG. And the residents were incredibly welcoming, and I had a great conversation with the pediatric heme faculty, so I ranked the program high on my match list. And in March, all the hard work finally paid off. I matched. I was genuinely excited. I started my residency in 2024, threw myself into clinical work. And by September, after getting used to the residency schedule, I started working closely with the Peds Heme department, joined several research projects, and was preparing several manuscripts, abstracts, and conference presentations. And then October came when we had our first meeting between first year residents and the program director.
All right, so tell us what happened next.
So several of us shared ideas for improving the program, but instead of being welcomed, those suggestions, to our surprise, were met with resistance. And over time, the residents who spoke up started facing increasing pressure from the program director. In my case, she began calling me into repeated one-on-one meetings where she questioned my medical knowledge and whether I would be able to successfully complete future rotations. And when I would ask her for specific examples, I was pointed to comments that were not in any evaluation system, and no faculty members were identified as having made those comments. And every time I asked what this anonymous feedback was based on, I never got a clear answer. And what concerned me even more was during one of those meetings, the program director suggested I should be evaluated for ADHD. And it came completely out of the blue. It was very difficult to hear. You see, I have never been referred to a psychiatrist or psychologist in my life, and no one ever suggested I needed that kind of evaluation. And that was the moment I started feeling that something was not right. I
Hmm.
was being told I had a problem that I didn't recognize in myself, and no one could clearly explain why.
Now, from what I understand, you started at this new program in the summer and up until that first one-on-one meeting in October with your program director, when you voiced some suggestions for the program. After that meeting, then some of their concerns started to come up. As far as you know, were you thriving in that program? Were there any warning signs that may have led you to suspect that there was something going on? Tell us what it was like during those first few months.
Sure. So by the time things seemed to be going pretty well, so I had completed my rotations with positive evals. I scored above the national average on the pediatric in training exam and was heavily involved in research. As I said, during the interview, I had a very productive conversation with the pediatrics heme department, and they knew my background in oncology and research. So right after I adjusted to residency schedule, I started working with them closely. So we wrote together two manuscripts, about five abstracts, and I was actually getting ready to present clinical cases at an upcoming conference. So from my perspective, things were going pretty well. But as I told you during one-on-one meetings, the program director just suggested I have issues, and the feedback was anonymous. So it was very hard to understand who exactly made those comments and how this happened because nothing concrete was given.
And you didn't receive any personal feedback from the physicians during your clinical rotation, correct?
Oh, actually, we had this electronic evaluation system, and everyone could just look it up and see the feedback that the faculty would give. Even the residents who you worked with could leave the feedback there, and it was pretty good. And I passed my rotation successfully. There was a scoring system which was used to evaluate whether the physician in training could continue further with the program, and I was passing all the needed scores and was just completing one rotation after another without any problems.
So, according to the story, you suspected that ever since that one-on-one meeting where you brought up some feedback to the program, that's
Oh, it
when it
was not
started.
one-on-one meeting. It was sorry for interrupting, Kevin,
Mhm.
but it was a group meeting.
Oh, I see.
So it was the meeting with the residents of the first year and the program director. So not just me, but several other residents also said that there were some things that needed improvement. And I will tell you a little bit later as I continue telling you my story, but those other residents started feeling pressure from the program director as well.
So, before moving on in your story, what exactly was aired during that meeting? What were some of the concerns that were brought up to the program director?
So most of the concerns were related to heavy workload
Hmm.
because during night shifts, we didn't have enough staff helping the residents to cover their shifts. Also, the changing schedule. So sometimes people would notice that their schedule would be changed about like 2 or 3 days before the actual rotation took place. Also, there was concern from the residents who were rotating with us from other hospitals. So some of the family medicine residents were saying that they were not given any clear instructions on what was expected from their work, on how their work was supposed to be evaluated. And those were like the main concerns from my perspective. I'm an IMG. I haven't completed my medical residency in the US. I was not sure about the medical documentation, so there was not any specific format. And I was just proposing that we perhaps would have some kind of sample or template that we could use that would help us effectively put everything we need on the medical documentation.
All right. So tell us what happened next. So you mentioned that you and your fellow residents in that meeting were feeling pressure from the staff. Where did you turn to, or did you turn to anyone for some support, help, or anyone in your corner?
Mhm. Well, first, I tried to speak with the faculty. And from my perspective, it was a logic thing to do because I'm personally a non-confrontational person. And I try not to push back when speaking with someone who is higher in the hierarchy. So some of the faculty members who I spoke with, they were actually sympathetic.
Hmm.
So they understood that there was something going on, but they all advised me not to push back and to accept the situation as it was and just moving forward. And that's what I actually decided to do. So I didn't try at that point to connect with anyone else but the faculty. And after their feedback, I just kept my head down, focused on my work, and genuinely hoped the situation would improve on its own.
All right. So you put your head down, so to speak, and continued to work. Did the pressure continue to increase? Tell us what happened next.
Yeah, so by February, the things escalated. So the program director asked me that I should go the focused review process, and for some of the viewers, focused review is a formal performance improvement process when a resident is considered to be failing and is placed on a closer supervision. I was also told at that point that I was no longer recommended to participate in conferences or research projects with the HEMONC team, and that was quite frustrating. Also, what was included in the focused review plan was the mandatory psychiatric evaluation for ADHD. So again, I was advised something against my will, and that thing there that really kept me thinking, okay, enough is enough.
So I find it hard to believe that there wasn't any reason. Like they put you on this focus review and suggested that you undergo ADHD evaluation. Any specific reason that they gave you to put you on this plan?
So the main reason that the program director named that she was worried about the testing abilities. So there were two pediatric in training tests. So one happened right after I started residency in July, and I didn't do quite well back then. So, and usually the pediatric in training tests would be scheduled for residents, regardless like what rotations are they on. So some people were on night shifts. For me, it was inpatient unit, which was pretty heavy on clinical responsibilities, and it was again my first month of the residency overall, so I suspect that I didn't achieve the scores I was hoping to, and perhaps that kept her thinking that maybe I should be evaluated, and by all means the pediatrics program director is a adolescent medicine physician, so some of her work is also related to working with people who are having ADHD, and these symptoms sometimes can be related to, performance on testing
Mhm.
and performance on clinical evaluation. So those are maybe some of the things that come to my mind that can be related to her referrals to psychiatric evaluation and ADHD in particular, because her professional experience and also that the first in-training exam was not as successful as maybe both of us wanted.
So as far as you know, just to be clear, the only deficiency that you can remember was the fact that your in-training exam scores perhaps wasn't as good as you wanted them to be in terms of patient
Exactly.
care, interactions with your other residents and nurses. As far as you know, those were fine.
Well, to the best of my knowledge, and according to the electronic evaluation system, which I already mentioned, there was no concern, no problems with previous rotations, and no, let's call them suspicious comments about my performance or achievements by the time.
So now you mentioned you were moved to ACT. How did you respond?
Well, first I tried to gather some information from other residents as well. So, and I noticed that some of them also were criticized just after that meeting in October. So some of the residents who were also IMGs, they were, the target of some jokes. Some of the residents were speaking with them in loud voice. They were giving more heavy workload. There was also one physician, she's actually American, and she was heavily criticized because of her age and was even encouraged to leave the program.
Mhm.
And at the same time, the residents who appeared to have closer personal relationships with the program director, including helping her with family matters and childcare. They seemed to receive preferential treatment.
Hmm.
And then finally, we wrote together the complaint to ACGME. And what stood out that there was this meeting with ACGME representatives, and the residents who had raised concerns were never invited to meet with those reviewers. Instead, only those who were in preferential treatment with the program director met with the ACGME team.
Hmm.
And by the time point, I felt the culture of the program was driven less by professionalism and more by personal relationships. So I decided to transfer and to see where I could continue my training in a healthy environment. And looking back now, that decision ultimately backfired on me.
What happened when you tried to transfer?
So I met with the program director and I told her that I had decided to transfer. And to my surprise, she appeared to take the news quite well. So I was expecting actually some pushback and like questions why I decided to do so. But in fact, she expressed her full support for my decision. So she said, if that's what you have chosen, then I will completely support you.
Hmm.
And then the April came. I had started communicating with other programs and was doing my shift in neonatal unit. And after one of those shifts, I was unexpectedly called into a meeting with the program director. And from the very beginning, this new meeting felt different.
Hmm.
Two things immediately stood out. First, I was told I couldn't go alone and I had to be accompanied by a senior resident. And second, the meeting wasn't even held in the children's hospital where we usually met. Instead, I was taken to an administrative building this time into a formal conference room. And when I walked in, there was the designated institutional official, two faculty members, and the program director who were already sitting there. And almost immediately, the program director began reading through a long list of allegations against me. And when I tried to respond and explain my side of the story, the DIO stopped me and said that no explanations or objections would be heard at that time.
Hmm.
I was then told to hand over my ID badge immediately. I asked for documents or at least any evidence supporting those allegations, and I wasn't given anything. And after that, one of the faculty members escorted me out of the building. And I was walked out in the middle of the workday in front of my colleagues and my patients. And I still remember that as one of the most humiliating moments of this entire story. And later, during the legal process, I learned that preparations for my removal had actually begun several days before that meeting. The decision has been made before I even walked into this conference room. So no one actually expected me to present my side of the story. Everything was already decided for me. And after the day when I just had to give up my ID badge, I was escorted out. I was never allowed to be back into any university building or facility.
And at any point during this process, did you engage the services of an attorney or some type of advocate for your side?
That's a really good question, Kevin. I would like to do that, but because, you know, it happened, first of all, abruptly
Hmm.
in the middle of the workday, and I was forced to give up my ID badge, and I was just disconnected from all the electronic systems of my university. I just couldn't do that. I would love to, but I just couldn't. And no one from the university's legal office reached out to me. No one responsible for supporting international trainees contacted me either. And since my university access had been revoked, I couldn't reach out myself. No one explained what my rights were, what
Hmm.
options I had, or even where I could go for help.
Now, we have a few minutes left in our conversation. And as you replay those events in your mind, Would you have done anything differently if you had to go through that again?
I would say I would try to maybe reach out to any university services that protect IMGs and that support residents in terms of maybe ask for advice of specific employees in the university who might have had similar examples of some situations when the residents do not understand the program director and vice versa. So if anyone who was having any experience with that, maybe I should be proactively and look for help earlier. But at the same time, I'm realizing now that it could have probably been the same outcome. Even if I looked for that help, the best thing that they would advise would be to, again, try to keep your head down, try to complete your rotations, do not argue with the program director, and it would pretty much lead to the same consequence. And after that event unfolded, I tried to look for lawyers, and no lawyer would take my case because I'm a foreign medical specialist on a J1 visa. So everyone thought that was very risky to proceed with me. And there were also questions about the immigration status.
Mhm.
So even with, like best possible environment before these things happened, options for IMGs are pretty much limited and you have to, do it on your own, which I pretty much did. So I filed an appeal for my case, first through internal university systems. And then when I found that there were actually violations of several, federal and state laws, I wrote to the President of the United States, who, initially invited me to the country under the Fulbright Scholarship. And I received the response from Washington to keep on, fighting to stand up for my rights, which gave me some extra force, to keep moving. And I filed several claims and even filed an official investigation with the ACGME, with federal agencies, and the claims with the state commission. So those are now under review.
Mhm.
And maybe in some time, I will be able to give you more details as events unfold.
Now, to your fellow IMGs that are listening to you on this podcast, from your experience, what kind of advice can you share with them?
Well, I hope my experience helps to raise awareness of the challenges that international medical graduates and even some American residents can also face. And I hope that it encourages others to stand up for their rights because no one is above the law. And when you see something unfair is happening and something unlawful, then you do not just, keep your head down, but sometimes you have to speak up and no one is above the law, not even those in the highest leadership positions. So you should know your rights, keep fighting for what you think is fair, and never give up.
Vasily, thank you so much for sharing your story time and insight. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Kevin.